Hello everyone, I'm Ragnar, and today I want to give you my thoughts on Vampire the Masquerade Swansong, a freshly released narrative RPG by the French developer studio Big Bad Wolf that came out on May 19th for PC on the Epic Games Store for PS4 and 5, as well as Xbox One and Series X and S. Most people who follow me know that I love Vampire the Masquerade with a passion. I've been playing the tabletop game since I was 15 years old, which is already over 20 years by now, and have released loving hymns of praise in video form in both classic video game adaptations, Bloodlines and Redemption. And despite the recent disappointment about the debacle surrounding the hotly anticipated Bloodlines 2, we've still been getting quite an onslaught of Vampire the Masquerade and other World of Darkness adaptations on various different platforms. Now, one game in that lineup I've been eagerly awaiting for a good while is Vampire the Masquerade Swansong, which made me extra excited when publisher Nacon approached me and asked if I was interested in getting early access to and doing a sponsored video on it. Now, I've been wanting to get the game and potentially cover it anyway, so I said if I can A, play it before I decide, and B, have zero obligations to hold back criticism or to have bought opinions on it, then I'm game. They replied, I heavily paraphrase, hell yeah, we want you to be honest about the game. And so, I jumped straight in, and after playing just a couple of hours of the review copy, I knew this was going to make for a highly interesting launch review. So, in this fresh off the top of my head, spoiler-free showcase, commentary, and critique, I'm going to go into what kind of game Swansong is, how it plays, looks, and feels. I'm going to share with you what I think is great about it, whether things it attempts work, and what I find interesting, engaging, and intriguing about it. But I'm also going to go into a good handful of caveats and criticism that I have of it, that I think you should be aware of before buying it yourself, to know what you're getting into, and if this game is actually for you. Because there's a bit more to it than how it's been advertised that I think people should know about. Now, a quick note before we get going. I'm someone who plays a lot of retro games, and I realized that my rig has gotten a little long in the tooth by now, which meant I actually had to dial down the graphic options a bit to be able to record fluidly. It wasn't super low, but the footage recorded with my computer doesn't represent the game at its best. I've also asked a friend to play through a few chapters. He's got a better computer, so whenever you see footage recorded with my rig, I'll add a little potato icon in the corner so you know it's my potato machine, for reference. Might also be interesting as a benchmark for people with older hardware. Anyway, so what is Vampire the Masquerade Swansong? According to the trailers and PR from publisher Nacon and developer Big Bad Wolf, Swansong considers itself a narrative RPG set in the world of Vampire the Masquerade. Across its story campaign, you take over the role of 3 different kindred that are involved in a series of dramatic events revolving around the Camarilla of Boston. And by 3 different characters, I mean you don't pick one and roll with them for the rest of the game, but from chapter to chapter you switch between characters for different missions or scenes in which you engage in operations orchestrated by your local prince. The player characters are Gala Bazori, a 300-year-old, highly influential Ventru whose history goes back to the Ottoman Empire, Lewis, a Toreador who fled Paris during the Nazi occupation and became a club owner and influential Camarilla member in Boston in the decades after, and Leisha, a Malkavian who receives powerful prophetic visions but has been kept under lock and key in an insane asylum and only gets released and reinstated when the prince's need for her prescient abilities. Leisha is suffering from obscured memories, and she's at all times accompanied by her daughter Halsey, who is also a child of Malkav. Whether you're a Vampire the Masquerade veteran or not, you can already hear that I'm tossing a lot of setting-specific vocabulary around, and that's quite in line with the game. Swansong is both lore-heavy and lore-savvy. This is a story not just set, but firmly rooted in the World of Darkness, with all its intricacies and peculiarities, with its rules and groups and secret societies and its very own elaborate vernacular. Luckily for the uninitiated, the game comes with extensive codex entries, where you can read up on important terms and concepts, and conveniently the game gives you a prompt to jump right in there whenever a term is dropped that might be hard to understand for newcomers. To me, as a longtime fan, the rendition of the World of Darkness in this was pure bliss. Aesthetically, it absolutely nails what I expect locations like a Camarilla court, an Anarch hideout, or a Red Salon to look like. And I also love how the designers obviously put great emphasis on fashion, something that has gotten a big focus in the 5th edition rulebook, which I personally really love, but I know that people are torn on 5th edition. The kindred in this game are sharply and appropriately dressed for their standing in vampire society, absolutely true to unlife, and it just feels wonderful to have this rendered out in such fidelity. The character models look dashing in their best times, which makes me look past the fact that the facial animations feel a good bit wooden and outdated, something that feels quite striking in a game that puts such a high emphasis on deep conversations, especially considering how ahead of its time Bloodlines was in fucking 2004. Speaking of Bloodlines, you might think that Swansong has some very big shoes to fill. As a narrative-heavy RPG set in the world of Vampire the Masquerade, it might have to be measured against Bloodlines, one of the best written games of all time, and as an interactive branching narrative, it now must hold its ground against Disco Elysium. They say when you come at the king, pardon, prince, you best not miss. But I don't actually think that Swansong ever intends to come at the prince. It is unavoidably derivative of many games that employed similar styles and mechanics, but tries to be its very own thing. And that's overall very good, because it made me intuitively measure it on its own terms instead of playing the compare game all the time. A menacing threat is brewing at the Boston Camarilla. The game's story begins after a secret vampire party has been breached and attacked by an outside influence, and so you're being sent to investigate and gather as much intel about this phantom menace to nighttime society, and eventually, hopefully, act against it. You do that by taking control of one of the three characters in third person and playing out various scenes from their perspective. For that, you move freely around in sometimes quite extensive areas where you investigate clues, solve puzzles, sometimes move around cloak and dagger, and most vitally, talk with people. This is one of the biggest strong suits of the game, its conversations. Each character you meet and interact with is a fleshed out and extremely well-voiced individual, and conversations often have a non-linear flow. To get information from them, convince people, or get them on your side, you have various ways of steering a conversation in your favor. You could say, winning a conversation. Yeah, because one of Swansong's biggest game design twists, the part where it considers itself a narrative RPG, is that it has no combat. Or at least no simulated real-time or turn-based combat found in most other RPG adaptations, but instead conversations, and especially those that are considered a confrontation, are treated like a turn-based combat encounter in which your goal is to literally win the confrontation.
Somebody tossed something, and I want to know what it was.
Oh, that's why. I understand.
For this, you can use conversational skills such as intimidation, psychology, or persuasion, or you can employ your vampiric powers to dominate or overwhelm your opponent. Each of your characters, as well as every character in the game, has an extensive character sheet that determines in which areas they're strong or weak. These confrontations can become surprisingly tense because they're not as easy as it might seem. In the beginning of the game, you choose one of three archetypes, or you start from scratch and assign skills and vampiric disciplines at your own discretions. So you could decide to build a highly persuasive silver tongue who is extremely well educated and knows how to operate computers and technology, or you could make your character a psychological mastermind who's great at deductive reasoning and lockpicking, or many different combinations. If you succeed at your objectives, of which there's a wild variety, many of which are optional or not at all clear that they even exist during your first playthrough, you get rewarded with experience points that you then can put into further refining your character stats over the course of the game. Only between chapters though. Focus and hunger are your primary resources to draw from, and they're handled like a cold, hard currency for both conversations and actions outside of that.
Yes, of course.
Like hacking or picking locks will cost you focus, while using disciplines like celerity to make giant leaps or obfuscate to copy uniforms or whole identities and disguise yourself increases your hunger. You can replenish them by partaking in optional conversations, which gives you focus back, or by feeding on humans in safe rooms. Yeah, a vampire game needs a feeding mechanic, right? Or if you're a humanitarian, you can also feed on rats at the cost of suspicion, a shared attribute between all characters that makes skill checks harder the more suspicion you accumulate. Alternatively, you can collect rare consumable items that replenish these values or give you other boosts. This is the core of the RPG part of the game's self-coined genre descriptions, and I love the idea behind it. Social combat is one of the things I always admired about the Vampire the Masquerade tabletop. In a time when most tabletop RPGs had the heaviest focus on constant combat simulation, VTM went for a far more socially focused experience, and gradually the actual fighting became, at least for most people I know and played with, more and more secondary, honestly. And this was one of the things I was most excited for with this game, that it completely omits any form of direct combat simulation. It's not without violence, it's just not a third-person shooter or strategy game. And honestly, that's something I think is often the weakest link in RPGs, and especially in both previous Vampire the Masquerade RPG adaptations, Redemption and Bloodlines. The social combat is an amazingly fitting replacement for that because it perfectly represents the Machiavellian realities at a Camarilla court. And appropriate for a Vampire the Masquerade adaptation, it does some very, very clever things with its dialogue combat mechanics. Like, I love when games use mechanics in inventive ways to tell story, and I'm gonna stay as vague as possible to refrain from spoiling any discovery on your own. Swansong does that in multiple instances, where it establishes rules for its mechanics and then it confronts you with a situation where the rules you've internalized suddenly get broken by the game in seemingly nonsensical ways. And it gave me pause, at first confused, is the game bugging out on me or what? But then I stopped and started to think about it. What does it mean that the numbers here behave in these specific ways that seem to undermine the game logic? Under what circumstances would this actually make sense? I heard the cogs rattle in my brain until I came to a sudden, eruptive epiphany that led me to foresee a plot twist that wasn't revealed until a good bit later in the game. And I was spot on. This happened multiple times in many different ways, and, well, in best Bloodlines tradition, it also made for some really gratifying, twisted, subversive, game mechanical Malkavian storytelling. That's the most you'll get out of me. But I was glad that Swansong was able to pull this off, because it adds a lot to a good Vampire the Masquerade adaptation if you ask me. Now, for that to work as well as it does, it's also very important for Swansong to absolutely nail its cadre of characters and the web of interpersonal relationships, fears and motivations, mannerisms, intrigue and subterfuge going on between them. And luckily, this game pulls that off. It's absolutely one of its strong suits. For players, it really, really pays off to take the time to learn how characters think and feel about each other, how they're related and what their backstories are, who is whose sire and who is whose child, and do they actually have a good relationship with each other? Most likely not. It feels extremely intricately woven and well thought out, and there always seems to be another layer to the interpersonal connections between characters. It's a beautiful constellation of characters.
I don't need your help. Ma'am, please. Stop calling me that.
Getting back to how the game plays, there is a lot of things to do for you with that. What I realized over time is that Swansong's individual scenes feel a lot like an immersive sim without active combat. Large, open-ended stages with many different approaches to solutions. Lots and lots of documents to read, audio logs to listen to, and other snippets of world building to discover, which flesh the story and setting out in extremely granular depth for the patient players who love digging deep into the minutiae. I was also surprised by how heavy the emphasis was placed on detective work in the game. There are multiple scenes where we have to investigate various crime scenes or otherwise piece information together about what happened on the basis of the information and clues presented, for which we also can use our vampiric senses for support, reminding me strongly of the detective mode scenes with Geralt in The Witcher 3. What I especially like about this is how much it respects the intelligence of the player, actually. Like, when people hear narrative game, most will intuitively think something like David Cage games, which might throw the odd mini puzzle in here and there, but which largely play themselves. Not in Swansong, because you really have to sometimes piece stuff together all on your own with only the crumbs you can find. How many crumbs you can find is determined by your diligence, patience, and performance, but also by your character's skills, or rather where you decided to spend your experience. This is a neat concept in theory and works in parts, but it can also lead to frustration because quite a few times there is a clear, better path through the choice of skills and abilities fully dependent on the scene you're playing, and that you have absolutely no means of anticipating before you start out. But more on that later. Another determining aspect is how the other characters perform. Since you play their scenes in succession, and only sometimes have the option in which order to approach them, your performance, including the many moral choices you take, which often have quite a hefty impact on how events unfold in the future, all this makes it very likely that one character's actions will influence the scenes of other characters later down the line, either helping them or disadvantaging them through your actions. It's quite a cool concept, a bit similar to the Indigo Prophecy, only better and without QuickTime events and without David Cage's grubby fingers all over it. I've thought that this game, like Swansong, theoretically would make for an excellent 3-player hot seat multiplayer experience. Have 2 friends over and play through, each of you chooses one of the 3 characters and you swap between scenes, and you can choose if you want to piss in each other's cereal with your choices or have each other's backs. It's not going to be a very dynamic playthrough though, with constant tag teaming, because especially during a first playthrough when you're still figuring things out, the scenes can go on for quite some time. And so through choice and consequence, you talk, deduce, sneak, manipulate, puzzle, and scheme your way through a highly interesting plot that involves a lovingly written and realized vertical cut through many of the facets of the world of Boston by Night, in what I honestly think is in many ways the most artistically impressive and enticing adaptation of Vampire the Masquerade since Bloodlines. This is a game that's clearly made by people who love the setting with a passion, and that's not just reflected in the characters, locales, and the abundance of nerdily accurate lore, but also in the choice of its systems, delivering an experience that wants to put role-playing first. Sure, no video game adaptation is ever going to be as flexible as an actual tabletop campaign, where the players can say, "We want to go to McDonald's," and the storyteller just ad hoc improvises the McDonald's of Doom or something like that. But the fact that Swansong offers many different paths through its story, many of which you can easily completely overlook depending on your performance and choices, and even leaving the possibility that you can finish the entire game without realizing the bigger picture at all, that's a fantastic approach to adapt a role-playing game into an interactive video game adventure. In theory. Because while some elements of Vampire the Masquerade Swansong are really well executed and work tremendously well, engaging and fun in a vacuum, they do not always work together like clockwork. The game has many elements that form a complex interplay of systems, and in multiple parts of the game, they feel not balanced well enough that I regularly found it outright frustrating. This often had to do with, on one side, unfulfilled genre expectations, and, for lack of a better word of putting it, the game not really being sure what it wants to be. A bit of an identity crisis. While Swansong advertises itself as a narrative RPG, as I said, and delivers all the elements that enable this, the game is also in large parts an immersive sim, as I said. And it also quite often functions like a classic traditional adventure game. Like, I'm talking point-and-click type adventure, where solving puzzles is the main thing that progresses the story. And my impression is that Swansong doesn't really understand that it is an adventure game, because it bumbles straight into many of the time-honored design pitfalls the genre has long grown out of over decades of trial and error development. Design traps such as over-reliance on mandatory logic puzzles, which completely change the core challenge of the game. It's always a problem when you stall the progress of your game behind a completely unrelated lateral thinking challenge when the rest doesn't require this approach. It can completely throw off players who are not savvy at or fond of them. People who buy this game because it promised to be a narrative role-playing game will, I guarantee you this, feel extremely broad-sided and frustrated when being forced into a sudden mandatory Rubik-style algorithmic puzzle in order to progress the story. In fact, I actually asked a friend, the one who recorded the footage with better graphics, who hates puzzles, to play and record a couple of scenes as a test case. And as I expected, when he encountered some of the roadblock logic puzzles, he exclaimed that this was when, for him, the game took a sudden and drastic shift from being interesting and intriguing to,
"Why do you suddenly fucking force me to play fucking Sudoku? It fucking makes me want to commit seppuku. Fuck."
kind of frustration. In a tabletop RPG, it's bad practice for a storyteller/DM to introduce a logic puzzle to the players and then make it absolutely mandatory to solve this on their own, or else the campaign won't move on. It's not just frustrating if nobody can come up with a solution, it also doesn't make sense considering that it's not the thinking of the character or their role-playing that's being tested, but their own mental gymnastics. ludonarrative dissonance, baby.
Oh, come on. There's more.
Another pitfall of adventure games Swansong sadly falls into, especially in the second third of the game, is making players endlessly search for needle-in-a-haystack items to move the story forward or solve an optional challenge that's clearly visible but not solvable without this said needle-in-a-haystack item. Or the old adventure game sin of requiring an object from Area A to solve a puzzle in Area B. If the player is able to finish Area A without picking up and keeping the object in their inventory, and if they have no means to acquire the object anymore once they are in Area B, the game has reached an unwinnable state, a dead end. It's classic bad adventure game design, and it should be of the past. Ron Gilbert came up with a puzzle dependency chart as early as the first Monkey Island to make this problem a thing of the past. Now, just to clarify, when I'm saying dead ends, I only once encountered one that forced me to reload a scene, but that seemed more like a bug that might already be fixed in the release version, no idea. None of the dead-end inventory items that I came across prohibited me from actually finishing a scene. They only happened with optional objectives, which might just be intended like this. Nevertheless, felt frustrating because punishing me for something that was effectively not my fault. Now, sometimes using your abilities and disciplines actually allows you to bypass some of the logic puzzles, which is good practice for an RPG. That's not for all puzzles though, some are absolutely mandatory. The caveat with this is that it comes at quite a high cost of focus or hunger, which, since the resources are very finite and precious, then often results in you failing conversation confrontations or other skill checks later down the line, which results in a worse performance of your scene. Which is fine, everything comes at a cost and the value is high, but it can create frustration, like I said before, when it feels like you're being punished for something that you simply couldn't have anticipated. As you can also only circumvent it if you've advanced the correct skills, which you had no means to foresee at the time of skill point distribution, at least in your first playthrough. And I think this is really my major issue with how the game balances and structures its story and character progression, and especially the resulting conversation encounters. It is a punishing game at times, and I absolutely respect that, actually even like it. But it often feels like it's constantly punishing you for things that de facto aren't your fault. The term narrative RPG implies that I can actually roleplay my character. For example, in my first playthrough, I decided that my interpretation of Galeb is that he's got a strong presence, is intimidating in conversations, and as a 300-year-old Ventru originating from the Ottoman Empire, very well educated. And I made this decision not just on a whim, but because I had extensively read up on his backstory provided in the Codex and found that this approach fit his characterization perfectly, in my opinion. And then it turns out that for his first mission he's sent to investigate a homicide crime scene as a detective. And because of my choice in how I built this character, I was constantly barred from making leaps due to my lack of deductive skill in favor of education, and the conversations kept dangling unavailable options in front of me for all the other dialogue skills except the one I had focused my points into, which led to constant failure on all fronts, both in the tutorial scene and the entire first mission. Now this would be okay if failure in this game would be treated less as a failed state, but more as an interesting alternative outcome of the narrative. I've said numerous times in past videos that a good DM is a DM who knows how to make failure interesting, fun, and engaging. But there's only a small handful of examples in this game where failure feels actually interesting and not like a bad thing that you caused. Like, as an example, keeping the spoilers to a minimum here again, confrontations where your failure leads to, say, injuries whose scars your character visibly carries with them for the rest of the game. But most of the time, failure is literally treated as just that. You fail and it results in you losing something as a penal measure. Less information, worse outcome of the story, less experience, plus the UI rubbing it in your face that you performed badly. So because I failed quite extensively throughout the mission due to it not accommodating for my role-playing of Galeb, I ended up with a subpar performance, which resulted in far less experience points to spend at the end, which in turn made my Galeb underleveled, making it harder and harder for me down the line to advance his skills in a way that allowed to avoid this type of failure in the future. Sometimes you receive some pity points, such as regaining a point of focus for a lost conversational confrontation, but compared to what you'd reap for succeeding, these are a dime a dozen. In that sense, balance-wise, rewarding success with extra experience is very much a double-edged sword, because it means that the way encounters are designed in this game makes some role-playing choices effectively more correct than others. And I want to stress that this happened to me when I picked one of the 3 predetermined character archetypes instead of assigning the points manually, which you'd expect the game to definitely account for. But no, I ended up running into surprisingly many dead ends and lack of skill situations, which made it feel like being told that my choice of character preference was the wrong choice. And that's the last thing an RPG should do. Punish you for the character you decide to play. Like in a tabletop, the storyteller's role is to shape the story to the player's characters so they have an engaging time. That doesn't mean to not put up challenges ever, but if your player says, "My character is a nurse," then the storyteller shouldn't go, "Sorry, your skill is worthless here. I wrote my campaign for a soldier. You fail." But instead come up with ways in which the nurse skill set leads to interesting solutions to the problem, as an ad hoc example. Swansong sometimes falls short here. Like, let's say conversations. I genuinely love the approach of conversations being treated like literal confrontations, dramatic verbal standoffs between characters that are played like turn-based combat. Social combat. It's one of the things I've always adored about Vampire the Masquerade, finally implemented in a high production value video game. A dream come true. And for the most part, this feature in Swansong is absolutely fantastic, make no mistake. These encounters tend to become, because the stakes are high, no pun intended, really tense at times. Or if you are superior to your interlocutor, making you feel very powerful in a gratifying way.
Open the door. Now.
Very well.
It works. A lot of this tension arises because choosing the wrong option or failing in a skill check often has immediate and dire consequences. This is cool. It feels fresh, interesting, and makes conversations exciting in ways that few games have managed to pull off. In its best moments, this feels like Eastwood vs. Van Cleef, but with words. It only gets punishing when failure is not the player's fault. And that happens more often than it should, at least in my perception. This can be due to the thing I just talked about, having skilled your character wrong, meaning in a way the game didn't accommodate for, which is something I frown upon as an adaptation of social combat from Vampire the Masquerade, because if I play a tabletop campaign and get into a social combat situation, I always have the option to use any of my dialogue skills for a reply or a rebuttal. If the adversary is very strong at the thing I'm attempting, well, then it's just a very hard check, but I'm allowed to try it. In Swansong, you can only pick the option that the game gives you, and that feels often arbitrary. Why shouldn't I try psychology on this character? Let me, and fail, it's fine. But the game didn't write these options here, so you're shit out of luck. It's nothing you as a player, especially during a first playthrough, can anticipate in any way, which makes failure because of not having the skill the writers offer you feel, yeah, no other word to describe it, unfair, and the consequences you pay even more so. The second way in which these can be a bit obtuse is, well, you know this trope in narrative games where conversation options are presented to you as a short summary of the essence of what your answer is going to be. And then when you click it, your character, in a perfect world, says what the short version indicated, but just in longer form. I've always hated this system, always, because in every single game that uses it, at some point the thing your character says ends up being not at all what you expected from the preview version. I always find this infuriating, especially in conversations that have weight, when you end up choosing the wrong option because the path description suggested something very different to what is being said in the end. And especially in a game where the dialogues are surgical precision, social combat, confrontation, and failure is mercilessly punished, this dialogue system is poison to the game's ambitions. I've had multiple cases where the option I chose ended up being almost the opposite of what I thought it meant. This has been solved in other games, either very simply and directly by just spelling out the full reply, or quite elegantly in Guardians of the Galaxy, where hovering over the shorthand menu option will show you the full answer your character is going to use. Leaving what your character is going to say even the slightest bit ambiguous in a situation where you're gonna slap the player on the wrist for choosing the wrong option is game design that's unfairly punishing. It's like the dialogue option saying shoot pistol, and you think, okay, that's great, let's shoot the pistol. You click it, and then your character pulls out this thing and shoots themselves in the kidney. Great, you fail. Now, overall, these are my biggest points of criticism with Swansong. I don't mind smaller, nitpicky stuff because I far more appreciate what this game is trying to do and the many ways in which it achieves it. Each and any of the systems Swansong employs, be it the social progression system, the dialogue that feels like combat, splitting the narrative between 3 characters, the choice and consequences that pull through like a string of pearls from beginning to end, and the Hitman-like immersive sim-type level design, each of these are elements that are not completely new, but this specific combination as a foundation for a narrative-heavy role-playing game, especially set in a very lore and rulebook-savvy rendition of Vampire the Masquerade, are unique and fresh and fascinating. It feels like the things that made me grumble and snarl a bit over the course of my playthrough are things that I was ultimately able to, well, not completely ignore, as this video is proof of, but come to understand as growing pains in a game that tries to take both narrative games and role-playing adaptations into a fresh, new, exciting directions. And I'm all here for that. Fail upwards. I played the game from start to finish and then immediately started a replay, not because I had to or felt forced to for the review, but because I was genuinely hooked and intrigued. And I ended up approaching these stages very differently than before, like a giant interlocked immersive sim puzzle. I really feel like the Hitman comparison here is quite apt, because I can't recall how often I played the many iterations of the Budapest Hotel, always trying to come up with new and more optimal solutions, and that's very similar to how it works with Swansong for me. You're absolutely not supposed to ace it in your first playthrough. Going back in with actual knowledge of the scenes, the potential goals to meet, the characters and conversations you're going to encounter, and all the minutiae, and then strategizing accordingly in order to optimize your approach towards a more and more ideal outcome, that's a whole other gameplay layer. One that I ended up highly enjoying, honestly even a lot more than what I expected a narrative RPG to feel like. It feels to me that the way the game advertises itself is in part inaccurate, because as a narrative RPG, it falls flat for the simple reason that it at times punishes players for trying to actually roleplay. But as an open-ended, dialogue and puzzle-focused adventure/immersive sim crossover that incentivizes optimization of stages like a giant, complicated social puzzle, it phenomenally works. And you can tell that the designers actively encouraged this approach, as you get a summary sheet at the end of each scene, detailing all the things you've missed, which highly incentivizes you to try it again, with more knowledge. And once you've completed a scene, you can also skip and fast forward all sequences and conversations, which drastically changes the flow of the gameplay. I personally would have wished that the game doesn't arbitrarily prohibit you from skipping things before you've fully completed a scene, because when review testing the game, I had multiple instances where I restarted a scene to see how things would play out differently, but because I hadn't, in the system, reached the ending of the scene at least once, I had to sit through every single line of dialogue all over again, no skipping allowed. There's many cases in which this restriction feels incredibly arbitrary. Say you've already played the game, but reinstalled it or got it for a different system. Well, too bad, not a single second can be skipped. You have to sit through everything all over again. I'm bickering far too much on this. My point is, this should be removed. Make conversations skippable always. Make things more accessible. There's a million individual reasons why players might really need this feature early on. Which, late addendum, well, is going to be my fate now, because when the game upgraded from the review to the release version, all my save files were immediately voided. This is pretty standard, and wouldn't be a big deal if it didn't mean for me that I now have to sit through every millisecond of conversation and cutscene again with zero means to skip anything ever. There is a perfect case for this already. It's definitely gonna add some reluctance for me to go straight back in and imsim it, as I had planned it. And one more thing I've noticed, there's a sequence where a character wakes up with the game simulating a high-pitched noise, ringing in their ears for quite a while, and as someone with chronic tinnitus, I've had to take my headphones off until it faded. I'd have loved if the game gave a menu option to deactivate high-pitched noises for hearing-sensitive players. Anyway, I really do want to end on a high note here, because if you know my videos, you'll have noticed that this one featured an uncharacteristic amount of criticism and nitpicking. So does that mean this game is somehow worse than the other games that I cover? No. No, not by a long shot. When I cover older games, I try to find the fun in it and don't concern myself a lot with harking on about the bad. Like in my video on Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, I could have gone on for easily half an hour to point out the endless amount of flaws, shortcomings, and frustrations with the game's systems, but what's the point? There's a whole cottage industry on YouTube that's all about bashing old video games. I'd rather focus on finding what's genuinely lovable and redeemable about them. But for a game like Swansong, that just came out and where I'm one of the first people to release a video review on, and a game that tries to move the genre of narrative games forward into a fresh new direction, tries something new that I'd personally love to see more of, this criticism is my testament to this very desire, because these design problems the game stumbles over, albeit causing the odd frustration here and there, are issues that can be perfectly learned from and improved upon in case of a continuation of this trend. And there really isn't that much to jot down. Bottom line, do away with the mandatory logic puzzles, make every character build at least viable so you don't punish players for actually role-playing, avoid classic adventure pitfalls that have been solved for decades, such as the constant searching for needles in a haystack, and would immediately level up the formula. Those are my 50 cents. I also specifically hope that bringing up these points of contention I had with the game will be helpful for anyone who thinks of picking up the game for themselves, avoid or at least anticipate these possible frustrations and thereby make them potentially far less frustrating in the first place. The expectations with which we engage in games is a massive factor in how we end up enjoying them. I would absolutely love if this wasn't the last narrative vampire RPG produced by Big Bad Wolf. They've done a great job on this one. Despite some of these, as I call them, growing pains, I genuinely enjoyed this game. The story was interesting and gripping start to finish, the cast of characters highly diverse, well thought out and multifaceted, and both story and game design presented me with many a clever storytelling twist and had me make some gut-wrenching decisions that actually ended up having a major impact on how the plot played out in the end. That, plus its super fresh, interesting, and challenging alternative approach to conflict in a video game without relying on reaction-based simulation of violence, this game brought so many interesting elements to the table. All crafted with a deep respect and love for the source material it's based on and a gorgeous aesthetic rendition of one of my favorite game settings. I've played it for 3 days straight and I'm still enjoying the hell out of it, and I'm definitely gonna keep replaying some of the scenes until I get the perfect run. Maybe not quite as obsessively many times as I've played Hitman Budapest Hotel, but Swansong has brought back that itch. This ever-present, slumbering, immersive sim itch that I did not at all anticipate to wake upon going into this game. Maybe though I should finally invest in updating my potato rig though. Thanks for watching. Until next time, ta-ta.